Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight. My name is Dr. Sarah Kinahan, and I'm the Executive Director at the Slattery Center for the Ignatian Humanities. On behalf of the Slattery Center and the Schemel Forum, it is my pleasure to welcome you here. I'm thrilled to introduce this evening's speaker, Charles R. Gallagher, S.J. Father Gallagher received his PhD in history from Marquette University, and he currently serves as a professor of history at Boston College. Previous to his position at Boston, Father Gallagher worked as a visiting fellow at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations, teaching undergraduate and doctoral courses on religion and international relations. Before that, from 2004 to 2006, he taught in the history department at the College of Holy Cross in Massachusetts. Father Gallagher's scholarly work focuses on religion and right-wing movements, the Holocaust, American Catholicism, Vatican diplomacy, and the intersection of religion and espionage. In 2008, he published the book Vatican Secret Diplomacy, Joseph P. Hurley and Pope Pius XII, which won the John Gilmary Shea Prize from the American Catholic Historical Association. In 2012, he edited, along with Alberto Maloney and David Kurtzer, a volume of essays entitled Pius XI in America, Proceedings from the Conference at Brown University. And in 2017, he was the William J. Lowenberg Memorial Fellow at the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Most recently, his book, The Nazis of Copley Square, The Forgotten History of the Christian Front, which was published in September 2021 by Harvard University Press, won a Catholic Press Association Award for History. His current work considers the life of Joseph E. McWilliams, founder of the Christian Mobilizers, and known during the World War II era as Joe McNazi. Over the last couple of months, I've had many lovely conversations with Father Gallagher, and I've had the opportunity to learn a little bit more about him. In our first conversation, he revealed he was an Office fan, and we spent more time talking about that show than we probably should have. We had to schedule a follow-up call to talk about work. And I just recently learned that his dad is a Scranton Royal. Given these wonderful connections to our small town, I sincerely hope he enjoys visiting Scranton as much as we've enjoyed hosting him and hearing about his work. Please join me in welcoming distinguished author and scholar, Father Charles Gallagher.
Thank you, Sarah. That was truly a humbling introduction. I would like to also thank you for your invitation and for your kindness and openness and willingness, and to thank you for coming tonight. I'd also like to notice Professor Roy Domenico of the History Department, Chair of the History Department at University of Scranton. Roy was very supportive of me as a young scholar in the American Catholic Historical Association. I'm indebted and grateful and thankful for your friendship. Again, my dad went to Scranton on the GI Bill. He basically before the war he was working in a factory, came out of the war, was able to go to college, came to Scranton, and I grew up in Binghamton. And he wanted me to come to Scranton for university, but you know how kids are when they're 18, it was too close to home. So I think what I'm doing here is I'm a historian. I'm an old-fashioned historian. So I like to dig around in archives and old papers and find things that people haven't found before, hopefully, and write about them. So I have to, when I do my digging, I have to have the mindset of figuring out how what I'm looking at is important. And so most of what I'll talk about today is material from my book, The Nazis of Copley Square, in which it's a strange title, but basically what I did was I discovered a Nazi SS, that's the black shirts, spy ring being run out of the Copley Square Hotel in downtown Boston during World War II, and the target of the spy ring were these religiously motivated Catholics from South Boston. And neither the principal people in the spy ring, both the spy and the target of his recruitment, no one had written anything about. From that, no one really knew who they were. I uncovered that, discovered it, wrote about it, and we'll hear a little bit about that. And what I found was these issues that are part and parcel of what today is called Christian nationalism. So issues such as immigration, sovereignty, America first. These issues were all very part and parcel of what my early religiously motivated Catholics, Christians were doing. They called themselves the Christian Front. And and then this guy is Joseph E. McWilliams. He's Joe McNazi. More on him later. So I'm just going to basically talk about the concept of Christian nationalism, give you some ideas about what I think it is from my research as a historian. And so I'm just going to flip right through. Okay, so this guy's named Gerald L.K. Smith. He was popular in the 1930s through the 1950s. He was the first, so the reason he's up here is because he was the first person to try to run a political party that was called the Christian Nationalist Party. So about 2 years ago, because I was writing in a lot of these right-wing movements, I started getting phone calls from journalists and others about Christian nationalism, and I thought, my goodness, did they dust off Gerald L.K.? He's a reverend, Gerald L.K. Smith. He went to Butler Seminary. Very, very amazing speaker. Did they dust off Gerald L.K. Smith or Gerald K. Winrod, another Protestant preacher from Kansas who was a Christian nationalist in the 30s through the 50s? I'm like, I was thinking, like, where did this come from? So I kept looking at it, but you can look at what he's writing about, even in the 40s and 50s. So for him, it's matters of life and death. So very apocalyptic, his political view. And again, he's the first, in my view, he's the first modern, well, at least post-war personage who wants to create a political party connected to Christian nationalism. And it's about a handbook for patriots dealing with issues on which America will rise or fall. That's the subtitle. And then the creed of Christian nationalism. He's front and center talking about what he views as Christian nationalism as a concept that is going to guide his political party. He was hoping to become president in 1954. He started his party as early as 1950, got a number of Catholics, Christians, coast to coast too. He's big in California, big in the Midwest, not so big on the East Coast. But, so this is what I want to, in my research in the archives, this is what I feel Gerald L.K. Smith does. He, for the first time, creates the distinction between theist politics, and by that I mean electoral party politics, theist politics and atheist politics. And he says, this is after World War II, he says, from now on, political parties are either going to adopt God as a thing in their political platform, or they're going to eschew God. Now, he's an extremist, but here we are in 2024, and I think these are questions we need to ask, particularly when it comes to electoral politics, because that's, well, we'll get more into that. So he suggests this as early as 1945, 1950. This is what you call Gallagherism. I tell my students, this is something I made up. But then I also tell my students, like, you're paying $70,000 to go here. Might as well give me the fake, right? So my Gallagherism is that I kind of divide Christian nationalism into two types. And this is my historical understanding. One I call restorative Christian nationalism, which often, and we'll go through this in the slideshow, it often ends up projecting itself and manifesting itself as aggressive and potentially violent, and in case of the Christian Front, potentially lethal. Okay? And then the other is integral Christian nationalism. And by that I mean these are earnest Christians who are politically active and have their Christianity inform their political action, so electoral political action in particular. That's new, and I'll talk a little bit about why later. This is a little bit more from Smith. Again, another picture of Smith. This is his for our purposes, this will be what Christian nationalism is for the next 20 minutes. It's basically to preserve the effort to preserve America as a Christian nation. Now, we'll see many different influences pushing that impulse over the course of the decades. But, and for Smith, it's a number of impulses that are very particular to him. But coming back to what is Christian nationalism now, I use Althea Butler, University of Pennsylvania. I'll let you read those, because I don't like to read from PowerPoints. But let's just say that these are relatively, in my view, relatively 5 good points that we can use to understand Christian nationalism. I disagree a little bit with the first point, the kind of divinely appointed nation, kind of the city upon a hill. I'm not sure modern Christian nationalists necessarily view it that way. I think, and I'll talk about that later. But here is one of the other issues that I noticed with Christian nationalism and why I was scratching my head about how the term came up a couple of years ago. When you do the research, there were absolutely no books, nothing was published between 1917 and 1955 on Christian nationalism. It wasn't a thing. And it wasn't a blackout either. It just simply wasn't a thing. And then that's why I began with Smith. Smith actually uses it in electoral politics to create his presidential run, his political party, the Christian Nationalist Party. Others will actually follow Smith in doing that. And then he kind of, basically, his theories of Christian nationalism are put out not in books and articles, but in pamphlets. He's a pamphleteer, a speaker, and a preacher. So then, the first real book on Christian nationalism from 1955, there's another gap. The next book comes out in 2006. So I kind of wonder what the heck is going on with Christian nationalism as a historian. Because I gotta say, I mean, I've been writing in these areas for, you've known these, like a little goofy grad student. Like, just Christian nationalism, I teach a course called American Fascism, the History of the Right Wing. I'll teach maybe a 45-minute course on Christian nationalism. So I'm just wondering, like, where it's coming from now. So I'm sorry, we'll get into more of that later. But this is kind of the past of it. So there are current books on it, very good books, excellent books, which you can look at here. But and then another one just recently out in 2022. Good university presses putting them out, excellent scholars. They tend to, now what's fashionable is to tag Christian nationalism as white Christian nationalism. Okay? Keep in mind, the other thing too is it's difficult for me as a historian. All of these great academic books published on Christian nationalism are published by sociologists. Like I think Perry is a sociologist at Yale. There's a difference between historical understanding of things and sociological understanding of things. So sociologists tend to look at, they look like at Christian nationalism like you're going to a zoo and they're kind of like looking at the animals trying to figure out what they are. And basically, and Christians, particularly who are under observation, they don't really like that. They don't like being looked at as objects. Mainly because they're not able to express how they feel in terms of their faith, which oftentimes is ineffable too. But it's coming out now, the latest is to tag Christian nationalism with a white moniker. But then this is another Gallagherism. I'm sorry to say that in my historical researches, I don't find white supremacy as operative in Christian nationalism historically. Why? Because for Catholics and Christians of all denominations, there was one great racial equalizer. Anybody want to give a guess as to what that is? Catholics, Protestants, one great racial equalizer. Baptism, right? So in the Christian Nationalist group I look at, the Christian Front, they ran recruiting drives in Harlem. They had African American members in their organization, and they were kind of incipient, or what we call primordial, Christian nationalists. But once you were baptized into Christianity, you were welcomed in as a member of both their kind of quasi-political organization, but also the church. And so, so that's why, I'm just not finding it. We can ask questions about that later. This is basically what I'm kind of getting at in this presentation, is that the real basis of Christian nationalism in its early phases is neither white supremacy, nor is it essentially anti-communism, but it's actually anti-Semitism, which I'll explain. So it makes sense, because what did L.K. Smith divide politics into? Theist politics and atheist politics. And so, in his view, it's the arrival of communism and the Russian Revolution that creates that split. So why hasn't the history of Christian nationalism been written? Truth be told, I want to write it. This is a guy, very famous, political philosopher and I think political sociologist at Harvard. And he basically says we haven't had a history of Christian nationalism. Why? Because they packed no punch at the polls. So they just simply did not have any punch at the ballot box. And I see that in my research as well, but we'll go on from here. Now, that's not to say they didn't proliferate, because yet I say the 30s, 40s, really through the 60s and 70s, I see 4 early Christian nationalist organizations. By that I mean they believed in that notion of the preservation of America as a Christian nation. They're also again anti-immigration. They're anti-illegal immigration. They're all for legal immigration. They're anti-Semitic. And they're anti-communist, which we'll get into in a while. But these are all parties that were religiously nationalist and Christian. The Union Party ran a presidential candidate in 1936 named William Lemke, but the founder of the Union Party was a Roman Catholic priest from Detroit. The Christian Nationalist Crusade, that's L.K. Smith's group. And then I argue that the American Nazi Party of George Lincoln Rockwell in 1960, which was founded in 1958, Rockwell is he founded this party called the Nazi Party, and they wore swastikas and battle dress, and they praised Hitler. He said that organization was a-religious, but in my research, there's Christianity all through his kind of not only background, but his political positioning of the American Nazi Party. And then finally, you get one Christian nationalist party that actually runs a candidate for Congress in 1940. This is the priest I was talking about who started the Union Party and also was the philosophical inspiration for the Christian Front. And he has 3 different impulses that he's working on. The first and most important is Judeo-Bolshevism. 1917, the Russian Revolution, and also Russian Civil War convinces Christians that this new materialistic, globalist, expansionist political philosophy known as Marxism-Leninism And you have to put Lenin in there because Lenin weaponizes Marx. Lenin basically has Marx fix bayonets. And they are convinced, both not only through the violence of the Russian Revolution, but particularly through the prosecution of the Russian Civil War, that Marxism, Leninism is bent on the extermination of Christianity because of what the Red Army, the glorious Red Army of people and workers, what they did with the Russian Orthodox Church. So you had to either join the state-sponsored church or you were shot if you were in the Orthodox Church. And so they saw this as particularly brutal, and I'll show you why. There's a key concept here. So what Coughlin argues, he's not the only one that argues, but he has 30 million radio listeners in the 1930s. Now that's twice as many as watched the normal, the highest rated TV show weekly in the US gets 12 million viewers. He had 30 million listeners on the radio every week. He argues that communism is nothing but a Jewish creation. It's generated entirely by Jews, that Marx was a Jew, that Lenin was a Jew. It's a myth, although Marx's paternal grandfather was a rabbi, and nobody knew that Lenin had Jewish ancestry until they did the DNA tests in the 1990s. But Coughlin is saying that basically what you have in communism is it's a political philosophy entirely created by Jews, and it's a-religious, it's atheistic. And so what he argues is that this communism is actually a secular religion created by Jews to seduce adherents with a end game teleology, right? It's got an end game, and it's an end game based in social justice, right? It's an end game based in social justice. But social justice for the Marxists is the elimination of property rights. You can't own your own computer. You can't own, it's basically an elimination of property rights. So then he mixes that with, and I get into this into my book, but this isn't a talk about my book, these other two Catholic impulses, theological impulses, Catholic Action, which is a social uplift movement, which eventually in the 20s, and by the 30s it becomes an anti-communist movement. And then mystical body of Christ theology. This kind of has import because he bases his concepts about Jews in Christian theology based on St. Paul. So what's happening is, so it's St. Paul's mystical theology of Christ, the part to the whole, the head to the body. So what happens to the Catholic Church in Spain has ramifications for the Catholic Church, for Catholics in Scranton. They, as Bill Clinton used to say, you feel the pain, right? And so what happens is, in the 1920s, the socialist government, Porfirio Diaz, they start persecuting Catholics. One of my Jesuit confreres, St. Augustine Pro, put up against a firing squad in Mexico without trumped-up charges, no due process, just summarily executed because he wouldn't recant his Catholicism. And so Coughlin sees that in Mexico, and then 1936 to 1939 is the Spanish Civil War. And the Spanish Civil War takes a huge toll on Catholics. So 10% of the Catholic clergy and of the diocesan clergy in the Archdiocese of Madrid was summarily shot by firing squad. We don't even know this stuff today. I tried to talk about this in my book, and I got a call from my editor, and he said, "I think you're not are these numbers true about the Spanish Civil War?" So I don't know if you knew this, but Pope Francis a few years ago put in a mass for the martyrs of the Spanish Civil War. That means just not even lay Catholics, but now religious nuns and priests. Guess how many died at the hands of the communists in the Spanish Civil War? 6,500, right? So I put that in my book, and I got a call from my editor at Harvard University Press. He's like, is this true? I'm like, yeah. And I'm like, that's a conservative number, right? So
the governments at that time, in the 30s and 40s, the communist governments, they didn't call themselves communist governments, they called themselves the Popular Front governments. And they were popularly elected. So Father Coughlin decides to create a Christian front, which is going to be his Christian nationalist group. And his idea was, if communists are taking up guns against Catholics and summarily executing them in Mexico and in Spain, it's about time Catholics take up guns against the communists. So this is what you get, right? Those are Enfield M19 rifles, each shooting a 30-06 shell, which is twice the size of the current bullet that the U.S. Army carries today. Each one, a bullet from fired through any one of those guns will go through a brick wall. You can't say that about the NATO round. And I used to be a cop, so I'm sorry about the gun talk. But it's one of the reasons why I got interested in it was because I kind of knew what the weaponry was. And so these Christian fronters, about 100,000 members, they formed a public-facing group, and then Father Coughlin had his street soldiers recruit members for cells that would be paramilitarized. So these cats are doing target practice, firing training, and they would have been in what was called the action committees. So there were about 5 or 6 action committees, about 10 to 12 people each, and they'd be trained on paramilitary firearm tactics, getting ready for the day when the communists would start their revolution so that the Christian front could counterattack in a defensive way. And we'll get more into that later. So when so this is basically Coughlin promoting, this is kind of who Coughlin was, and this goes through the what I just mentioned. This 1940 plot, though, they were training with their weapons. I call it in my book the false flag defensive counterattack option, right? And so these cats, the guys with the guns, were what I would refer to as restorative Christian nationalists, because their plan is not to just kind of keep Christianity consistent in America, it's to restore America. They actually are charged with sedition and seditious conspiracy in 1940. They plan to overthrow the government. They plan to start, so they were caching bombs in their basements, they were making bombs, they were caching weapons. And they planned to start a bombing campaign in New York that would push the governor of New York to call out the National Guard. And the publicity wing of the Christian Front would charge that the bombing campaign was perpetrated by the communists. And then the members of the Christian Front would take up their weapons alongside the National Guard, and they would move in to tamp down, to put down the communist insurrection, and thereby lead a restoration of America to its Christian roots through their own Christian patriotism. They would be the one that would be Catholic Christians restoring Christianity to America. It was a cockamamie scheme. It was bizarre, but it was, as I argue, it was rather lethal. So these are some headlines from the day when the FBI kind of swooped in on a raid. They're there again. They actually were making bombs in their basement. They were getting the rifles. They're all military-grade rifles, and they actually stole 2 Browning light machine guns from the armory in Waltham. They got these rifles and military weapons through membership in the National Rifle Association. In the 1940s, if you were a member of the NRA, you could write to the War Department, give them your NRA number, and they would ship a rifle not to your doorstep yet. They would ship it to your local armory for $7.50, and then for an extra $1.50, they would ship it to your doorstep. So you could get military-grade rifles shipped to your door for less than $10. What a deal! What a bargain! And so that's how. So this is the other thing when they were put on trial, and these are kind of heavy guns. this was from one report, I put prayer and target practice, one FBI report. They went to a firing range in Narrowsburg, New York, and which might be near here, isn't it? Yeah, so they went to Narrowsburg for their training, their target practice. About an hour? Oh, maybe I can visit on the way back. see where my crazies went and practice the overthrow of the government. So they would get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, shoot guns until 8 a.m., take off and go to mass at 9 a.m., and come back and keep training all afternoon on a Sunday. This is, again, these were headlines coast to coast. This was basically the thing that got me interested, was when I saw these headlines. And they were restorationists. They felt that the Jews and the communists, and to them they're symbiotic, that Roosevelt was putting too many Jews in his cabinet, too many Jews on the Supreme Court. And when they saw Jews, they saw communists. And when they saw communists, they saw Jews. And so that the restorationist part is really there. Now, they happened to win their court case. The prosecutor for the U.S. government was the dumbest smart guy ever to graduate from Harvard Law School. I have worked in his papers. The Jesuits who teach philosophy here, this guy, he needed a course in philosophy from Scranton, because this guy wouldn't know a syllogism if it hit him in the face. And he was a terrible lawyer. In fact, he has these great cases that he loses all throughout his career. Very high profile case named O. John Rogie. So they're not guilty, blah, 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 they get off, and then the judge has to give the guns back to the leader of the Christian Front. Right in the courtroom, he gives the guns back. It's rather extraordinary. So then the Christian Front movement moves up into Boston, and this is the target of the Nazi spy recruitment, Francis Moran. He's an extreme nationalist, an extreme hater of Jews. He's an extreme, hater of the New Deal and Roosevelt. And he becomes the public face of the Christian Front after the New York trial, because even though the trial was successful, they had to shut down operations in New York, and then it moves on up to Boston. And this is the guy, Herbert Scholz, who comes in. Again, no one's ever heard of this guy, but this is his lineage as a Nazi. He ends up being the consul. He's under diplomatic cover in Boston, and he recruits Moran to be a spy for him. The FBI, he runs circles around the FBI. See, no one knows about the relationship between Scholz and Moran, the guy in the previous picture, until I published the book a couple of years ago. That was all secret. Even the FBI didn't know that Scholz was running Moran as a spy. And Scholz, this is his lineage. He starts out as a young man under the tutelage of Ernst Röhm, who with Adolf Hitler founded the Brown Shirts. He then was recruited by Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust, to become a member of the Black Shirts. And then his first job was to work as aide-de-camp to Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, who was second in command of the Reich in 1934. And then in 1938, he was sent to Boston under diplomatic cover. And basically, he's just a spy. He's an energetic spy for the Nazis. And he was sent to Boston in 1938 to run an intimidation campaign on the former Chancellor of Germany, the longest sitting Chancellor of Weimar Republic, who was living in Boston and becoming vocal in speeches against Hitler, a guy named Heinrich Brüning. He was teaching political science at Harvard, and he was getting a little too vocal in his anti-Hitler speeches. So basically, Himmler and Hitler sent an SS guy to Boston to to turn the screws on Brüning. And you can read about it in my book. It's rather chilling. It's a very chilling intimidation campaign. I want to get back to this. This is how in my view, this is how the genesis of American Christian nationalism starts. These are three people you've never heard of: Elizabeth Dilling, George E. Dietrich, and William Pelley. Pelley's probably the most well-known, but these other two, really nothing has been written on, at least no monographs. But all three of these are going to lead right-wing nationalist Christian movements in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And you hear many experts talk about how the right wing is very parochial, and they're very, they all live in their basements and they're working on their parents' computers in their basements and they never get out of town. Well, what happened here is just the opposite. These are all extremely right-wing movement organizers. They all have one thing in common. They all visited Russia during the Russian Civil War. Pele was, because they were missionaries, you see. They were Christian missionaries. And in between 1920 and 1925, all three of these people ended up at one time or another in Russia. And they saw the violence that the Red Army was perpetrating against the Russian Orthodox Church. Pele was working for the YMCA, and he became the temporary news correspondent for the AP, the Associated Press. Deatherage also was, Deatherage went up to the front lines in the Russian Civil War, and he's a very devout Protestant from West Virginia, and he comes back and starts a thing called the American Nationalist Confederation. Dilling is from Chicago. She's a liberal, but once she goes to Russia and sees what's going on in the Russian Civil War, her Christianity gets piqued and she becomes a right-wing nationalist and a speaker at Bible camps throughout the nation. So these are three very persistent, very dedicated Christian nationalists, and all three of these, because of their exposure to international travel and to international events, they become basically Christian nationalists. And they are believing in the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism. This is George Deatherage. He's testifying in front of Congress here. Doesn't he look like something out of like a movie, like from the sci-fi movie from the 60s? And then kind of these are the reasons that they harp on, right? By the late 1930s, they're talking about government, particularly governments. They're very concerned about what they see as the Sovietization of the American government, right? So the New Deal, basically New Deal liberalism, smacks of Sovietization to them, because it's basically what Marx and Lenin were up to, and in their view. And also they see the role of taxation as, what's taxation? Taxation isn't taxation for the common good, it's confiscation of property and confiscation of wealth. And then also, they see the people in 1919, the Communist Party of the USA is founded in Chicago. And they see this as basically the arrival of revolutionary communism basically into the heartland of the Midwest on the shores of Lake Michigan. And so there you have, with the founding of the Communist Party USA, you not only have like the economic theories of Marx, you have anti-Christianity kind of placing itself into the political game in the United States, because they're a political party as well. So basically, Deatherage is a Protestant. He says Father Coughlin's going to work the Catholic side of the street, and they have all sorts of problems with New Deal socialism. This is just a visual of the newsletter that Deatherage was putting out. He was no bones about it. He was very pro-Nazi. So very, and again, his Christian nationalism was based really in anti-Semitism by and large. He's talking here about, and in this final quote, he's talking about whether he would choose fascism over communism, and he said, absolutely, I would take fascism over communism because of the property rights issue. I get to keep my property with the fascists. He's a strange dude. In fact, I don't know why he's testifying to Congress in 1939. I don't know why they asked him. This is the guy I was talking about. Joe McWilliams. Here he is now he forms a political party called the American Destiny Party in 1939, 1940. Runs in the 18th Congressional District in New York. Here he is Here he is standing next to Fritz Kuhn, who's the head of the Kaiser American Bund, the Nazi Bund, the kind of arm of Germany in the United States. And he actually, it's not shown here, but Kuhn would be wearing the swastika. He calls his organization, Joe McWilliams calls his organization the Christian Mobilizers. And he chooses the word mobilizers precisely because he wants to mobilize Christians to vote. It's a voting ploy. It's to get to the ballot box. He's not motivating them to go to church. He's going to motivate them to vote. Now, interestingly enough, you may think about your morning routine differently now, but Joe McNaughty, before he became interested in politics, was an inventor. And he invented the disposable handheld plastic razor. And he sold the patent to Gillette Corporation in 1933 for $10,000. So when you shave in the morning, you might want to have a second thought about where you're buying your razor blades. Because he actually, I have the patent. It's really wild. So here he is again. He's a very, very strange dude. But also all these people are very charismatic. They're very able to form crowds. They're able to get, able to form street crowds. Basically, McWilliams said that he wasn't born, he always went around with a Canastota wagon in downtown Manhattan, because he said, I wasn't born in a log cabin, I was born in a Canastota wagon. And then also, his group was known for much more violent street gatherings than any other of the nationalist groups. This is Pelly again. Just a little bit more about what he was doing. He kind of mimics a military style kind of posture. And just some visuals here. But if you look at the banner of his newspaper, it's For Christ and Constitution, and then Take Back the Nation from the Aliens. So that's restorative Christian nationalism again. So you've got a lot of these, in the 30s and 40s, a lot of the early Christian nationalism, in my view, was restorative Christian nationalism and prone to violence. Here he is, and you'd think that the L on his uniform would stand for loser, but it actually stands for light, because in his view, the Christians see the light and the Jews do not. So, you might remember the news reporter Eric Severide. So he changed his name when he wrote about the silver shirts to protect his identity, but this is actually Eric Severide writing in the 30s. Now this is an image from Pelly from 1930s, 1940s, and it shows kind of Jewish control of the Capitol building. So basically they're fearful that the Jews have taken over Congress. And then this is a post-January 6th image with the Star of David also on the Capitol with the image of Ashley Babbitt, who was the single woman, the Air Force vet who was killed by the police officer, was murdered, killed by the police officer on January 6th. There's Gerald L.K. Smith, and he wants to punch you right in the nose. He's a very militant guy, and again, these are a couple of things that he's about in terms of his Christian nationalism. This is kind of from one of his pamphlets. I just want to point out he's very much into the organizing against the enemies of Christ, and the enemies here are Zionist Jews, which he sees as communists. And then we see mention of this particular, so he's talking about America First, and this is kind of, again, early on. Then this is what I was talking about with the American Nazi Party. This is Rockwell. So I want to write a chapter in my history called Jesus and George Lincoln Rockwell, because I really think that his group is at least a quasi-religious party. He invokes Christ consistently, particularly in his fundraising letters. And then they had, you know how in the 60s the hippies had love buses? well, these guys, they had a hate bus when they Trump. It's just rather pathetic and sad. But this guy is either a minister or a priest here, holding the white power banner. Now he moves from anti-Semitism in the 50s to basically he does move to white supremacy by the late 60s, and so that's where I see the switch. But he's important in many ways. This is a quote from him. He said, "I'm not Jesus. Hitler is my Jesus, and I am his St. Paul." It's as Johnny Carson used to say, this is wild and weird stuff. Okay, I was either going to be a Jesuit or a stand-up comic. The editor, the book editor of Rockwell, that's the Nazi guy, the book editor of his journal, founded a thing by the 1980s and 90s, which is going to be called Christian identity. Okay. Suffice to say, you would have heard of Christian identity because one of its adherents was a guy named Timothy McVeigh, who planted a bomb at the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City in 1996. And that's William Pierce. And now here's a picture of William Pierce. He has direct connections right back to the American Nazi Party. Why do all his international evil villains have cats with them? I think it's a disservice to cats. But that's what he's about. So it kind of keeps morphing. It's a persistent kind of under the surface and over the surface. And then you get to this kind of modern signifier with Trump, right? And so by 2016, I think basically the shock of Trump even being the nominee was shock enough. And then there's I think political liberals are trying to kind of figure out where that all came from, and so you have you have academics trying to figure it out and starting their writing. One of the things I find is that professors of not religious study, but sociologists have a handicap in doing this, because I argue in the Nazis at Copley Square that in order to get this right about Christian nationalism, I argue, it was published at Harvard University Press, so you gotta at least fake being an egghead. They really expected blah 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 and all that stuff. So I'm saying you have to be an exegete, and that means you have to know your Bible, right? You got to know your Bible, and so a lot of the professoriate who's looking at this, I went to grad school in Binghamton. The old joke was there were more communists in Binghamton than there were in Berlin when I was there. Marxists don't want to study religion. They don't like religion. They're queasy about it. And so, all my professors were Marxists. One was even caching weapons, the story went. He was waiting for the revolution. But on the other end of the political spectrum. And so when you get something like Christian nationalism, you get a kind of a professoriate, it's kind of uneasy. That's why I think the sense that a historian hasn't written a history of this makes perfect sense to me. They don't want to get anywhere near it. Because they don't know, you got to know your Bible. You've got to have read Paul to the Romans to understand why a Christian nationalist is becoming restorative. You have to know that. They're violating the law of love, right? And so you have to know how that equation is being made. And that's a religious equation. If you don't know your Bible, if you don't know religion, you're not going to figure it out. And so I think that's what's actually happening in terms of this gap. And so you have Christian nationalists, the Patriot Church, you have pastors now coming around. And, now Satan is being, brought into the mix, and leftism, and here we go again, leftism, communism, back again. And then this is, I think the piece I didn't mention was the integral Christian nationalism. That a lot of these Christian nationalists who are not restorative Christian nationalists, they are just abiding by the historical fact that, as I put it, deists were theists. That the writers of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were deists. And for many people, that means that they didn't believe in revelatory understandings of religion or deep synthetic understanding of personalized religion, but they were still theists. God is written into the documents. And so for them, that God is a Christian God. And they're there in the foundational documents. So yeah, they were deists, but they were also theists. And so what they see today is the GLKS, the Gerald L.K. Smith equation. What we have here in terms of political party politics, one party has adopted theism. One party is unabashedly theist, will self-identify as theists. In this case, Christians. The other party, not so much. And so they're seeing the dichotomy between, and they're saying deists or theists, so where are we going to go? You know, what's authentically American is authentically theist. And then secondly, you have, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, we're in a Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, right? So the whole idea in the Founding Fathers lexicon was, when you create a Commonwealth, the voting public, the flourishing of the public, the right relationship of the republic to the government, to governors, is based on what? It's based on the minority actually subduing their political will to the majority due to their virtue, because they're virtuous citizens. It's based on moral excellence. The old Aristotelian, what is virtue? Virtue is moral excellence. How do you get moral excellence? Through your relationship with God, who is perfect and most excellent, right? So these Christian nationalists today, the integral Christian nationalists, in my view, they see this as a part, not even both their own experiential part, but also a cultural part of what America is. If you look at, this is the encyclical nobody ever reads about. If you're Catholic, the Pope writes letters, and there was a controversial one done in 1968. I encourage you to look at paragraph 23 of Humanae Vitae, which is an encyclical nobody reads because it's one that bans artificial contraception. But paragraph 23 is very, very interesting because it talks to leaders of government and tells the leaders of government that they must try to obey the moral law of God in their legislating, right? And in their policy making. So, and that's in the 60s. That's back in the late 60s. And then finally, we have this guy. He doesn't look very happy there, but his name's Luigi Tapparelli. He's a Jesuit. And he coined the term social justice. Now, if you came to Scranton, you're a freshman, you get bombarded with social justice. It's in every brochure. It's basically every social justice. I was a Jesuit for 22 years before I read that this guy coined the term social justice. So I called up the editor of the Cambridge Encyclopedia of the Jesuits. I said, "Is this true?" And he said, "Yes." And it is true. He coined the term. But 99.9% of Jesuits don't know that. And the reason is, social justice for him, Tapparelli, who coined the term, was connected to property rights. And property rights were the same thing that our people in the 30s were squawking about. And property rights is the same thing that the Marxists and the Leninists want to eradicate. And so I was like, well, so this is kind of a tussle of Jesuits figuring out what social justice is. So finally, where I see Christian nationalism most readily is in the work of Steve Bannon. So Steve Bannon got religion a couple of years ago. And so now he has, this is the Sacred Heart of Jesus image, and then the Virgin Mary there. And then he begins every broadcast. So before he was deplatformed from YouTube, he had 23 million followers. He's got at least 11 million followers on Rumble. I can talk about him in the Q&A too. But he begins every one of his episodes of War Room with the date. He says, "In the year of our Lord," March 18th. I think I have it here, March 18th, 2024. And then he's talking about the next election going to be a spiritual war. So I think he's kind of adopted the theist approach. And so we will see what happens. So this is kind of what I see happening in electoral politics. And I'm just finishing up here. I think you're going to see a return by Christians, an attempt to return to have some electoral activity based on their Christian identifiers. For political liberals in the room, you should have nothing to worry about. Because as a historian, what I found is that when nationalism and Christianity try to link up to motivate people towards the polls, they get shellacked. They absolutely have there's very little political power. So for example, Trump is an unlikely Christian leader, okay? He's an unlikely Christian leader, just ask Stormy Daniels. And but the people who are Christian and are going to vote for him, they're probably going to vote for him for a panoply of other reasons. It's either going to be the economy or $2 gas prices or the wall or migration. But they will identify as Christians sociologically. That's why I think we need more research on this, because I don't think we can just have sociologists writing about Christian nationalism. We've got to have other people writing about it. Historically, Christian parties just get absolutely creamed at the polls. So for political liberals in the room, you really have nothing to worry about, historically speaking. And then you have a return on the other side of full-throated anti-communism. And if there's one thing about Bannon and Trump, they're full-throated in their anti-communism. We're going back. We're back in the old days with GLKS, because the CCP in China, you had all these Cuban spy rings in the last couple of years come to light. But plenty of anti-communism in the Christian nationalists right now, and it makes sense to them, because the communists of today, if they're nothing else, they're definitely atheists. They're not theists. And so that's why you have a more full-throated anti-communism. But that's how they see it, right? So it makes sense to them. And then you have an incipient kind of anti-Semitism. I'm not sure. Now, this Gaza-Israel thing is really interesting, because it seems like that it's becoming partisan in terms of the politics in the country on that issue. So we'll see how that plays out. But the anti-Semitism has diminished on the right. Oh, there's My Pillow Guy. And My Pillow Guy has become rather adoptive of Christian symbolism. And he's an earnest Christian. He's an earnest Christian, too. That's the other thing, too, is that, when you talk about Christian nationalism, people who are integral Christian nationalists, it's tough to say, I don't want to denigrate people who are earnest about their faith. Particularly if they just think, well, I'm more religiously motivated to think politically. I don't want to denigrate those people. If they have personal relationship with Christ, I don't want to publicly denigrate them. I'm a Jesuit. It's got Jesus in it. I'm all for Jesus, right? But I want to do it so it's non-restorative, so it's non-extremist, and much more amenable to, the main thing for me is it's amenable to the law of love. To love one another as God has loved you. And when you see that equation going sideways, then that's a cause for concern, as we all know. So there's a little bit of anti-Semitism now coming up. This is from about a year ago, a banner at an NFL game. And that's the end. Sorry, I took too long. Sorry. Thanks.
We have about 15 minutes or so for questions. We have a microphone, so if you have a question, please raise your hand, and please wait until you have the microphone so that everybody can hear your question.
As you were speaking, Father, the one thought that was going through my mind, and I'd kind of like your opinion onto it. were these groups using McCarthy in the 50s, or was McCarthy using them, or was it a combination of both?
Yeah, so very good question. So these groups mimicked McCarthy in the sense that McCarthy, by the mid-1950s, was the first Catholic to politically link up with evangelical Protestants on the anti-communism issue. So the history of the right wing on this Christian nationalism hasn't been written for the reasons I outlined. And I think one of the things that you see happening much earlier than McCarthy is what I call an ecumenical anti-communism. So you have, for example, you have Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox linking together politically because of the threat of violence used by communist governments against them in society. And then, so in a sense, that defangs the kind of spontaneity with which we see McCarthy arise in the mid-1950s. We think he came out of the ether, just kind of came out of nowhere and started tagging anti-communism as a key issue. As a Catholic and with a Kennedy by his side, Bobby Kennedy worked for Joe McCarthy. So I think it's a much longer history, and I think that McCarthy comes out of a tradition now that started with these early Christian nationalists.
What happened to Father Coughlin?
So Father Coughlin was taken off the air in 1942. It depends who you ask. The Catholic Church will tell you that his bishop took him off the air, Cardinal Mooney. I was, you know how I go to archives and I dig around? So I was digging around at the Roosevelt Presidential Archive, and I was looking in the papers of the Attorney General a few years ago now, and I found a file on this. And the Attorney General Biddle threatened to sue Coughlin, to take him to court, sue him under the morale clauses of the Espionage Act. And what had happened is Coughlin was a very, very shrewd operator. He made his elderly mother the head of his newspaper. So like the corporate officer of his newspaper that was going to be prosecuted under the Espionage Act was actually his elderly mother. And the Attorney General Biddle said, "I will cross-examine your elderly mother in court. Do you want that to happen?" And my last name's Gallagher, so the Irish tells me every good boy loves his mother. So he basically had to back down so his mother wouldn't get cross-examined by the Attorney General.
So what happened to him?
Oh, so he went and lived a quiet life. He'd come out and do interviews every like 5 or 10 years and kind of prognosticate things. One of the final stories that I heard was he lived in a suburb of Detroit, and he had a Detroit seminarian go to the drugstore for him and go grocery shopping for him. Like, so for 2 or 3 years, this young guy would do this, and they spent once a week they'd go to the store, and the kid was going to graduate and become ordained a priest. So he said, "Oh, Father, this is the last week I'll be able to go to the store with you. It's very sad." And he said, Father Coughlin looked at him and he said, "Do you have a piece of paper and a pen?" He said, "Yeah." And he said, "I'm going to write something on this piece of paper, and I want you to," he put it in his top pocket. He said, "I don't want you to open it until you get back home." And the story goes that the seminarian dropped off Father Coughlin, and this is 1971 or 72, and the seminarian went back to his home and he opened up the paper. This is 1970, okay? And on the paper, Father Coughlin had scribbled, "Take all the money that you have and buy stock in Wendy's hamburgers." So you know what the seminarian did in 1970? He crumpled it up and threw it in the garbage because he'd never heard of Wendy's hamburgers. Stock tips from Father Coughlin.
Spoke about the Christian nationalists being anti-Semitic. And yet, I don't know, know, but the people in Congress today that I feel are Christian nationalists, maybe they're not.
Yeah.
They speak for the Jewish people. So
Absolutely. I didn't want to mention that because it's a pretty politically partisan situation. Like the best defenders of Israel are the strongest Republican voices in many cases, right? So that's a switch, right? Now back in the 30s and the 30s through the 60s, there was a belief that that communism and Judaism were symbiotic, that the two were joined together philosophically. That changes after 1945 and the liberation of the camps. I mean, you just can't reconcile the extermination of Jews based on any sort of political equation. And so as the UN Declaration of Human Rights takes hold, as the West kind of leans more towards issues of human solidarity, that gets the anti-Semitism part kind of drops off for Christian nationalists, and the Jews end up moving further into the Christian camp. Why? Because they're theists, if they're practicing Jews. And also, I think, interestingly, on the Israel issue, Israel-Gaza even today. And so what you're left with is a full-throated anti-communism with this crowd, with the Christian nationalist crowd. They still see communism as very threatening, very much threatening to not just to their political ambitions, but to Christianity itself. And I think that's what kind of is still floating around there. Yeah.
But that's also, so many of them also in Congress, not a lot, but certainly there are those in Congress, I'm sorry, that's someone's right in my eyes. But there are several in Congress who seem to support Putin at this particular time.
Yeah, so I hate to kind of back out on this, but I'm a history guy, so all that I could talk about would be what I read in the newspapers. Well, for these cats too, there's a anti-globalism thing. So they don't, which is in many ways right, goes back to George Washington. So for them, Ukraine is not an American issue, right? Soviets rolled tanks in 1956 in Hungary. The US did what? Absolutely nothing. The Soviets rolled tanks in Czechoslovakia in 1968. And what did the Americans do? Nothing, right? So the Soviets rolled tanks in Ukraine, and basically it's for them, for these Christian nationalists, and a lot of them, it's basically this is a European thing. Go to Brussels. Go to Brussels, don't go to Washington. And that's the way they felt. They've been very anti-globalist. They were, L.K. Smith and his followers were very anti-UN even. I mean, very anti-UN. So anti-globalist from the beginning, yeah.
Father Gallagher, are you able to speak a little bit about Christian nationalism and how it is or isn't developing in the youth in the United States? Maybe just is the circles that I'm following on social media and friends I have, it seems like a lot of young Catholics or Protestants seem to be becoming jaded with the status quo in the government at the moment. Could you speak a little bit about that? This is where
I wish I were more like, I don't know, maybe a sociologist, maybe I wish I were more kind of a historian of pop culture. Be honest with you, I'm much more comfortable in the 1930s than I am in the 2020s. And my social media presence is nil. But I would say that perhaps you want to look at these demarcations. Are these restorative? Are these people kind of yearning for a lost cause, a reassertion of Christian hegemony in society, or are they just simply identifying as Christians who have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, and that may or may not influence their voting patterns? You could, when you get on social media, that's a reference that you could use, a rubric that you could use to kind of figure out who's got potential to go sideways and who's got kind of just a kind of more earnest kind of understanding of their relationship with Jesus or with the church or with the sacraments. But I would say in all of this, and this is me preaching now, but in all of this, I think the key factor is to see how it squares up with the law of love. With Jesus's words on how to love one another. And that's the safe road, I think.
Was there any relationship with Charles Lindbergh with all of this?
Yeah, so this is, I get this question all the time, and I can say no, and the reason why, I think, is that most of these Christian nationalists are megalomaniacs, and they don't want to share power with anybody. And so Lindbergh and the America First movement, for Father Coughlin, for Deathridge, for L.K. Smith, that's Lindbergh's thing. And they want to be in charge of their own movement, and actually they want their own movements to become larger and become social movements and religious movements in their own right. And many of them are on the path to do that. Yeah.
Weren't there bombings in the early 40s that they actually blew up a munitions plant, and that's the real danger here? Not that they're going to gain political power, but they're going to escalate actual war.
The Christian folks?
Yeah.
So on bombings, there was a bombing. I don't know about a Christian or an alleged Christian nationalist bombing plot that actually came off. The bombings in the 40s that are notable that are the bombing of the British Pavilion in the 1940 World's Fair, and then the Nazi saboteurs who were offloaded off of Amagansett and Ponte Vedra in 1942. I might just not know about it.
It was the World War I bombings.
World War I bombings in Black Time.
Pre-World War II in New Jersey, there was a munitions factory that was blown up by some people. Yeah.
And was it tagged? Was it tied?
They eventually caught them. I don't remember if they were tried and convicted, but there was one of multiple bombings across the country.
Usually I would know about something like that, but I don't know about that event. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Appreciate your time.